Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for coming today. See a bunch of friends, old friends, and hopefully some new friends here. My name is Peter Mongeau. I'm president of the board of directors for the Wellesley Historical Society. I want to thank our sponsor today. The speaker series is made possible by a generous sponsor, Christine Mayer, and is presented in partnership with the Wellesley Free Library. We have a great speaker today, Jim Conroy. Jim is an award-winning author and honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. He worked on Capitol Hill as a Senate press secretary and a congressman's chief of staff. He served for 6 years in the Naval Air Reserve before graduating from Georgetown University Law Center and practicing law in Boston for many years. His first book, Our One Common Country, was a finalist for the prestigious Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. His second, Lincoln's White House, shared the Lincoln Prize and won the Abraham Lincoln Institute's annual book award. Please welcome Jim Conroy.
Well, thank you very much. I'm pleased to have made it to Wellesley finally, after living in Hingham for the last, I don't know how many years, 1982. I went to law school because they told me I didn't have to do arithmetic there, so I don't try to do the numbers. I appreciate you all being here. I'll just give you a real quick headline of what this is all about, and then we'll go right into it. The book is about the Casablanca Conference of January 1943, where Churchill and FDR and their combined high command, their very senior generals and admirals, met together in Casablanca for 10 days, really at the turning point of the war. Up until that time, not a single American bomb had dropped on Germany. Not a single American shot had been fired in Europe. The British had been carrying the war essentially alone since June of 1940, when France was overrun. We came in, of course, in December 41. It's now January of 43, and the stage of the war where the Allies were trying to just hang on by their eyelids, as one of the senior generals said, had finally gone by. The Americans and the British together had invaded North Africa in the fall of 1942, which was the first offensive operation of the war on the Allied side. And they had taken North Africa, and they had a big army there now, an Anglo-American army, a lot of Navy. And the question was, what are we going to do with it? What's the next step? How are we going to go out and try to win this war? So that's essentially where we are when we start the presentation. I should say at the beginning, I appreciate the introduction, and I can't say that my book is on Oprah's list, but it's not without a celebrity following. Lincoln's White House was mentioned, and you never know when you're going to pick up a fan, so that was a good start. So this will orient us to where we are in World War II in January of 1943. We have this map made for the book. First, on the Pacific side, Japan is in command of all of the black and gray area there. Japan proper is in black. South Korea, actually all of Korea, I shouldn't say South Korea. All of Korea was a Japanese possession, had been for decades. And also Taiwan. You can see Taiwan there in black. So that's essentially Japan proper in the black. And then everything around it is the territories they had conquered since the beginning of the war and still held. They had taken the Dutch East Indies from the Dutch, French Indochina from the French, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong from the British. And the state of play in the Pacific was dominant by Japan. Now, the American Navy had won two big naval battles before this conference took place, the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Coral Sea, both aircraft carrier battles, and had defeated the Japanese essentially in both of those, and stopped the offensive side of the Pacific War. The Japanese, having lost most of their aircraft carriers and a lot of their capital ships, just didn't have the resources to keep expanding that empire, but they were heavily dug in where they were. And the question was, how are we going to get them out, and what's the least costly in blood and treasure to get them out? That's issue number one at the conference. On the European side, similar situation, if anything worse. Germany is in black. Italy, its ally, is also in black. And all around it in dark gray are the territories that they had conquered and still held in January of 1943. And as you can see, it's essentially almost all of Europe, other than the British Isles, and a few neutral countries in light gray. Apart from Iceland in the corner, which was cooperating with the Allies, all of the other neutral countries were either pro-German or leaning German. Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Norway, all of those other dark gray countries, they're basically Axis friendly. So if you look at those two maps, I think the one word that summarizes it best is terrifying. That's the situation in which these men convened. Here's another quick map of the Pacific theater. Shows the scope of that Japanese empire, including some of the Aleutian Islands up there at the upper right corner. They had actually taken American territory. So they're really quite a formidable enemy. So this photograph is taken at the Casablanca conference, and I'll give you a quick survey of not the individuals, because we're going to talk about each one of them. This is a character-driven story. I try to make everything about the people. Statistics are good, but they're boring. So I try to bore in on the personalities and the characters. So on the first two guys in the front there, on the left side of behind FDR are the three senior American generals in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We'll talk about them each, as I say, individually. And on the right are the three of the British Chiefs of Staff, the three heads of the British Chiefs of Staff. And I think it's important to talk briefly about their outlook on things collectively before we talk about them individually. First of all, the British were an imperial power for the past 200-odd years. They had been a major power since the 17th century and had developed over those centuries a tremendously sophisticated system of military planning, organization, control. The book goes into it in depth. We don't have time for that, but just an incredible Swiss watch with every wheel and every cog geared together, working beautifully, total cooperation across the services, and a true depth of sophistication. They had a kind of a imperial condescension, if you want to call it that, toward their American brothers, which the Americans didn't appreciate. It didn't come across blatantly, but it was between the lines. You could sort of, tell that kind of British superiority back in 1943. One quote I like very much from one of these gentlemen said after the conference, or after the war, actually, the Americans were brave, helpful, friendliness itself is the way he described it, courteous, and very good at organization. And if you think about that, all of it could be said about a border collie. That's essentially, it was a very subtle but telling, if you pierce it out, they're good guys, but we know what we're doing, and they kind of don't. That wasn't too far from the truth, as a matter of fact, and we'll go through that as we go too. Stalin was not at the conference. He was invited, but he had a good excuse, because the Battle of Stalingrad was going on at that very time. So he was in the Kremlin with his high command, trying to keep their heads above the water at Stalingrad. So he was not in the game. Churchill, first of all, some of you may know this story, but this photograph is probably the most iconic portrait of Churchill. Was done in Ottawa early in the war, and the story behind it, I think, is telling in a couple of ways. First of all, when Churchill sat down to have his portrait taken by this very young Canadian photographer, he sat with a big cigar in his hand and a scowl on his face. Okay, so the 25-year-old or so Canadian photographer has him sitting there with his cigar in his hand and his scowl, and walks around the tripod and snatches the cigar out of Churchill's hand. And that's the look that he got. Now, Churchill, we need to know, was steeped in military strategy, military history, a graduate of Sandhurst, the British Military Academy, served in the British Army for a number of years as a young man. He was actually in the last cavalry charge in British history in North Africa. So you've got quite a span of generational spread here. He had written a dozen or so volumes of military history by this time. He had been the Secretary of State for War in World War I, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and, completely steeped and knew exactly what was going on, as I say in the book, from the grand strategy to the insides of mortars, every detail. Popped in on low-ranking, non-commissioned officers, quizzed them on everything, all that stuff fully in his head. FDR, picture taken about that time of the January 43 conference, was really just months away from a sharp physical decline. By the time, he met with, the next time they came around for the next meeting, he really had become a shadow of his former self. But at this point, he's still on top of his game in his prime as a leader. He had not ever been in the military in any capacity. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, but really not much involved in strategy. In fact, not at all, just sort of in the operational end of things. And had written nothing about military history, was not an expert in any way. Since the war began, he had read up and learned a lot and been briefed, but he doesn't have the same depth and the same expertise that Churchill has. They had developed a nice personal relationship. They'd met several times before, but it was at Casablanca, in the same place for 10 days, day and night, that they really formed the personal bond that carried them through the rest of the war. Quick little story that I think illustrates FDR's sense of humor, which is entertaining. This whole thing was secret, of course. Nobody knew it was going to take place. You've got all that high command on the Allied side going to be in the same room for 10 days. That's not something you want the Germans to know. So this was all secret stuff. FDR left for Casablanca on, I think it was January 2nd. On New Year's Eve, he and Eleanor had a little dinner party for friends at the White House, and FDR planted, if you will, a little joke that would not be apparent for about 3 weeks to come. They gave a private showing of the latest movie. And of course, after the headlines came out about where he had been, people got a kick out of that. So starting with the American side, now we have George C. Marshall, who was the Army Chief of Staff. And, these portraits are all chosen because they, as the cliche goes, are worth 1,000 words. And if you look at that face, you see a very tough, very military human being who would, as they said, he would take charge of a room by walking into it. He had this incredible command presence, dignity about him and authority about him that carried him a long way. He was no genius. He was no terrific military strategist. He was basically a very good organizer who had built the American Army up from almost nothing to this world-shattering force. But his real asset is this personality, character, the kind of person you just trust implicitly, used to giving orders. Another quick story, really quick one, I can't resist this one. After the war, his wife was interviewed in general, and she told some little stories, one of which was that in the middle of the war, he had taken her out on a drive in civilian clothes on a Sunday afternoon and pulled into a gas station. And as he pulled up to the pump, there were two young soldiers there with their car chatting up two girls at the gas pump. And they were done pumping and put the hook back and all, and they just stood there chatting with these girls. So Marshall kind of taps on the horn a little bit with his hand. One of these soldiers turns around and goes, "Keep your shirt on, Pop." So the wife is asked, "Well, what did he do?" She says, "He kept his shirt on." This picture, I think, tells a story too. Eisenhower, on the left there, was a protege of Marshall's, had kept him under his wing and brought him up through the system. And again, by way of personality, this is a little tour of American military base in Europe. And you can see Eisenhower over there already running for mayor. And to his right is Marshall, who looks like his dog just died. And that tells you, I think, something about him too. On the naval side, Admiral Ernest King was the chief of naval operations throughout the war, both before and during the war throughout. And as I say in the book, America was both cursed and blessed by Admiral King's leadership. Blessed because there was no finer naval strategist in the world than Ernie King. He masterminded the whole Pacific campaign from start to finish, which even the Brits said was brilliantly conceived and executed. Really a very accomplished, knowledgeable military strategist who brought that to good effect. On the flip side, the curse part, Ernest King was probably the most miserable human being who ever wore a uniform. Eisenhower said in his diary one time in the middle of the war, one of the good ways to win this war might be to get somebody to shoot King. Petty beyond belief, abusive to subordinates up and down, officers not enlisted who he took care of, and a very, very difficult, tough character. On top of it all, fiercely Anglophobic. So you've got a personality here that's going to be problematic. Many quotes in the book from him, but one that sums it up, I think, is that he said one time to an interviewer that civilians should be not told anything about what's going on in a war except who won at the end. And that was his approach to American democracy. On the Air Force side, General Hap Arnold, Henry Arnold, called Hap, and I think you can see why, had built the American Air Force up from almost literally nothing, like a few dozen very old, feeble planes, into a great Air Force, one of the great Air Forces in the world. And a lot of proteges here, but he was a protege of Marshall's. So Marshall had known him for many years and had brought him up through the ranks and given him great responsibility on the air end. At this time, there's no American Air Force. They're part of the Army, the American Army Air Corps. So he wasn't technically a member of the Joint Chiefs, but he went to all the meetings, and Marshall effectively gave him the reins on all of that. This is Hap Arnold when he was one of the first 9 American aviators before World War I, flying what he referred to as a bicycle with wings. Of those 9, 7 crashed and died in training. So if you look at that contraption and you get nervous about being up in a 747, think about that sometime. Moving to the British side, the Chief of Staff of the British Army, the Imperial General Staff, Sir Alan Brooke, not a household name either here or in England, not a field commander during the war except at Dunkirk. I'll talk about that in a minute. But at the top of the Army's strategic decision-making, another one like Churchill, very deep in the subject, advanced degrees, spoke 5 languages, including German, French, Urdu, and Farsi. A brilliant guy, dominant figure. One of his subordinates referred to him out of earshot as Colonel Shrapnel. He had this sort of abrasive, very demanding, difficult temperament, but knowing that that is what's required to make, a war get won. Very highly regarded on all sides, and probably the most demanding, difficult boss you could imagine to have. On the other end of his personality, he was a very talented bird photographer, a world-class ornithologist, and amused himself by drawing little sketches for his children like this, would sit in a conference, in fact, at this conference, sketching the faces of the people around the table. Very talented, both with his pen and with his camera. So, complicated guy with various aspects to his personality. Here he is on the bridge of a British warship with Churchill a few days after the invasion of France. Now that's out of our time frame, but there's a reason I'm showing it to you. Brooke and Churchill had a tempestuous relationship. They respected each other, they liked each other beneath that, but there were 2 strong personalities. Neither one used to taking orders from everybody, and clashed often, almost daily, in the chiefs of staff meetings and such. But afterward, would go on about business and close friends as well as partners in this war, but a chafing kind of relationship. Before the invasion of France, Churchill had insisted on going in with the invading force, personally. Everybody told him, no, sir, you can't do that. You're a bunch more valuable. We can't risk you for that. No, insisted on it, demanded that he would go. Until he got a letter from the secretary to the king. The secretary wrote, Mr. Prime Minister, His Highness's day would be considerably more anxious on D-Day if he knew that his prime minister was at the bottom of the English Channel. So even that didn't dissuade him until the king said he was going too. And that's what finally did it. So we're dealing with strong personalities is the headline on this. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound was the First Lord of the Admiralty throughout almost all of the Second World War. He died about a year after this, before the war was over. He had joined the Royal Navy at the age of 13 in the 1880s, descended from a Massachusetts mother and a long line of seafarers, Massachusetts seafarers. Like many of these high-end British statesmen and military people, a lot of them married Americans. We'll get to another before we're done. Very sort of likable, amiable type. The Americans enjoyed him, trusted him. They sort of relied on him for straight talk as opposed to the posturing that was elsewhere going on. Churchill was very close to him. Churchill said his slow, deceptive look is, what's the word? His slow, plodding look is deceptive. He is important to me. So that's Dudley Pound. The commander of the Royal Air Force, Sir Charles Portal, was a true aristocrat, born to a very high-end British family, landed estate, all of that, Westminster College, Oxford, the whole sort of 9 yards. Very young when World War I began. He joined the Army 2 days later and served for quite a while as a humble motorcycle dispatch rider, just carrying messages from one place to another on a motorcycle. Joined the Royal Air Force soon after it was formed and spent a good bit of his time shooting at German pilots with a rifle from the cockpit of his plane. He then, proceeds to advance through the RAF and was largely responsible for the Battle of Britain and the success of the British Army, the British Air Force there, and really the most liked and respected of the Brits among the Americans. Straight talk, amiable, did not condescend to them, and really served as a kind of a bridge between the two sides. Here we see him in command of the RAF with some of the pilots who won that crucial battle over the course of several months. Many of them, as you can see, were 19, 20 years old, and it was these few, as Churchill said, never had so many owed so much to so few. It was really a thin line of about 300 teenagers and early 20s young men who saved Britain from the Nazis. Last player here is Lord Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten, known to his friends as Dickie. Only in the upper class of the British aristocracy could a man with 5 names, none of them Richard, be known as Dickie. But he was very popular on both sides. You can see a kind of charming character. Apparently, despite being a grandchild of Queen Victoria and a cousin of the king, very personable, ordinary kind of guy. You would not have known any of that if you chatted with him. And Churchill took him under his wing as well. Not only made him an admiral, but also a general in the army and a senior officer in the RAF, just to give him a little bit of weight. He was about 39 at the time. So this is the hotel that the conference took place in, a suburb of Casablanca called Anfa. Very upper-end suburb, wealthy Moroccans and Europeans, villas and estates surrounding or right around this resort hotel, very close to the beach, overlooking the beach. Has a kind of a shape of a ship, if you look at it. And the conference took place in the bow of the ship on the first deck down there at the bottom. And when we saw photographs of that, I think you can take that out. The hotel had been commandeered by the Americans after they took North Africa. Patton had commanded that operation. It was his first big command. And Patton, commandeered the hotel and the villas all surrounding it, and picked the nicest villa, thought that was suitable for his own residence. And as the conference unspooled, people were distributed around these villas. There it is from the aerial view, and you can see those villas, some of them around it in a circle. This is a chart, I guess, of the venue, which I found in the papers of one of the junior officers who was there. And you can see the hotel in the middle with that rotary kind of around it. And the red outline is the barbed wire. They had put up a mile of barbed wire around that compound and housed all the dignitaries in the various villas around it. The one in the roughly at 1 o'clock is Churchill's villa, and 3 down from it on the right is FDR's. Churchill would every morning get up and walk over to FDR's, spend much of the day with him, lunch, come back for dinner, and the two of them spent most of this conference together, as opposed to at the table with the military chiefs who were actually working out the practicalities of how this strategy would work. I got to tell you quickly, during this whole hullabaloo, I mean, there were apart from all the barbed wire and such, there were tanks surrounding this. There were American day fighters in the air during the day, British night fighters in the air at night, anti-aircraft guns, a battalion of Marines, British Marines another battalion of an elite American unit. So this was highly, highly protected, as you can imagine. But the risk that they took, if you think about it, you've got the exact center, the center of gravity of the entire Allied command in that hotel for 10 days. And if the Germans had ever found out about it, it would not have been pleasant. Anyway, a German officer, or rather a spy in the pay of the Germans, Spanish spy, got word of what was happening there. How, I don't know, but he figured out what was happening. Sent a wire to Berlin in Spanish that said Roosevelt and Churchill are meeting in Casablanca. Some poor German officer translated Casablanca as White House. So the Germans thought they were meeting in Washington. Had his knowledge of North Africa been a little better, the war might have gone the other way. Who knows? So here we have Patton in the backseat driving, which is what he liked to do, with FDR in the front. Patton was put in the unlikely role for him of kind of a cruise director here. The war, the territory was already taken. The American troops had firm control of it, so there really wasn't any military task for him there. But he was in charge of the housing and the food and the entertainment, such as it was, and all of that sort of thing, which I've always thought is a little odd assignment for George Patton. At one point, he writes back home to a friend and says, "There's a big high-level conference going on here, which I am not in, thank God. I just want to go out and shoot somebody." This is FDR's villa that was assigned to him. Beautiful kind of Art Deco 1930s. The style was called Moroccan Modern. And it was the nicest, biggest villa assigned to FDR. Churchill immediately called it the White House, which took on, happened to be white, and everybody refers from there on out to the White House. Part of this 10 days, most of it, of course, was very tension-filled and difficult and stressful and categorically important, but there were also opportunities for some relaxation. The perfect weather, in January in Morocco is like in the 70s, beautiful bright days almost every day. And I show you this as an example of that aspect of things. On the left side of the table is Elliott Roosevelt, the president's son, who was an American Air Corps aviator. Next to him is Harry Hopkins, who was FDR's chief of staff, very influential, important figure in his world. To Harry's left is Franklin Jr., who happened to be stationed on a destroyer in the harbor in Casablanca when this took place, and was summoned to this spot, not knowing why, and showed up and saw his father sitting there. So it's quite a surprise for him. To his left is an old friend of FDR's, a reporter who had covered him for years, now in the Army Reserve, who was brought over to handle the press after the conference was over. Of course, there was no press during it because it was secret. But it gives you a sense of this relaxation, a little relief from the stress of the war. For the British, it was like nirvana, exquisite food, so many oranges everywhere. One young British officer said he wondered if one could do harm to oneself by eating too many oranges, thinking about what Britain was like in those days, rationing everything from milk to bread and being bombed much of the time and shelled. So it was really quite a nice break for them, as well as an important event in itself. I think many of you will remember Harold Macmillan, who was Prime Minister of Britain in the late 50s and early 60s. At this time, he was a diplomat brought over by Churchill, another protege of Churchill, primarily to handle the French. We'll talk a little bit about the French later, who were also there in a lesser capacity. Macmillan's a very charming guy, very funny, good sense of humor. I recommend his memoirs to you, which I used extensively. And at one point, he talks about going over to that FDR villa that I showed you at night, the first time he had been there. And he said floodlights were suddenly turned upon him. And the security forces around FDR leveled the most terrifying weapons he had ever seen, at his head. He had to show all kinds of identification and be vouched for and the rest. And he wrote about this, saying that the Secret Service reminded him of retired Chicago gangsters, which I thought was a little harsh until I found this picture. This is the Secret Service detail at Casablanca, and I think retired Chicago gangsters is not a bad summation. Another character in a kind of secondary tier, but important as well, General Ira Eaker, I guess it's pronounced, was the head of the 8th Air Force in London. The American Air Force being built up at this point, they hadn't yet struck Germany. They had occupied France and Holland, not yet Germany, but he was in command of that whole operation, gearing it up for the bombing campaign in Europe. The son of a Texas sharecropper, he was appointed by the higher command to convince Winston Churchill to follow the American plan for strategic bombing, much against Churchill's better judgment. In real capsule form, the British had been bombing by night, and only German cities, so that industrial targets, technically, a lot of civilian death. But they did that because they couldn't survive going in it in the daytime at low altitude. There were too many casualties. They didn't have the technology that the Americans had, which I won't get into here, but technology that allowed them to do accurate bombing by day or night. And their tactic, the American tactic, was to go in by day and hit the targets accurately with this technology that the Brits didn't have the technology to do. So the Brits were just blanket bombing Hamburg and Cologne and other places. The Americans were going in with much more targeted approach. Eaker convinces Churchill to let the Americans keep doing the day bombing while the British do the night. And the reason Churchill has to be convinced is the bases are all in England, and they really can't operate without his leave. But it's a pretty long story, and it's an interesting one. I won't get into it in depth. But here's this son of a Texas sharecropper meeting with Churchill for 2 hours and convincing him to give up his strategic view of how the bombing campaign should be directed. Another little bit of levity with Eaker. When the American Air Force arrived outside of London, they were stationed, the officers were quartered in what used to be a fancy girls' school, not far from London. And, nice big dormitory, they all moved into that. On the first morning they were there, Eaker takes up his office on the ground floor, and the men are moving in upstairs. After about 10 minutes, he hears a bell ringing, like an old school bell type, a handbell type of thing. You wonder what that is. Another few minutes, another bell starts going off. Then a third bell, okay? So he goes upstairs to find out what's going on. It turns out that on each of the floors, there's a little table against the wall with a handbell on it. And this is back from the fancy girls' school. And it's got a brass plaque over it that says, "Ring bell for mistress." Here is the conference table and the conferees at it. Running around from the left are the Americans, talked about before, Ernest King, Marshall, Arnold, the Brits on the other side. And in the far left corner, you have two secretaries. Both were brigadier generals. So you've got a place where brigadier generals are taking notes and writing up the minutes of the meeting on the following night. So they would break up at 5 or 6, and these two secretaries, British one, American the other, the British guy on the second from the end and the American to his right. The British, difficult job, to say the least. You have to kind of keep careful, good, accurate notes of what's being said, and then overnight put out the minutes, and then come back for more 10 days in a row. Vivian Dykes, the British officer, wrote a little poem about it. Very clever guy, funny guy, who's throughout the book. And so when the great ones repair to their dinner, the secretary stays, getting thinner and thinner, racking his brain to record and report what he thinks they will think they ought to have thought. Needless to say, this was not circulated in the upper end of the high command. So come down to the business end of this. The basic problems that had to be solved. There are two big ones and a lot of lesser ones. The two big differences of opinion between the Brits and the Americans is this. First, how aggressively are we going to fight Japan before we beat Germany? They were agreed that Germany was the prime enemy. Germany had to be defeated first and get the lion's share of the resources required to do that. Why? Because the Japanese, powerful as they were in East Asia, were not a threat to the United States or to England or to Europe. Okay, it's a regional, local threat. We've contained it. You know, we've won the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Coral Sea, and we'll roll them back, but this can wait, and we'll do it more gradually. The Brits wanted as little in the Pacific as possible, for obvious reasons. The Americans wanted a lot in the Pacific. They too agreed Germany had to be beaten first, but remember, the Japanese attacked us. The American people were far more hostile to Japan than to Germany. The greatest number ethnically of American troops were German. In other words, Irish descended, German descended, British descended. The biggest group were German descended. So there's a big German population. Nobody's a fan of the Nazis. Well, I shouldn't say nobody, but a very small number. But it was a tough sell to come for FDR to tell the American people, we're going to let Japan fester for a few years until we beat Germany. So that was the argument there. How much are we going to give to the Pacific and how much to Europe? The second big argument was when to invade France. The Americans came from the U.S. Grant School of Strategy, which is amass the biggest army you can, hit their biggest army in the face as hard as you can until they give up. That's how we're going to win our wars, okay? The British had for centuries taken a very different approach, primarily a sea power, also a land power, but primarily sea-oriented, smaller than the German powers, you know, the French and others, and not quite on the same level of ground warfare as them. So their strategy, which had always been the same for centuries, was to control the Mediterranean first. The first thing we're going to do is knock Italy out of the war, control the Mediterranean, build up that naval strength there. So now we can go anywhere we want to go with that naval power in Europe. And also our shipping doesn't have to go through all the way around Africa to England from the Far East, because the Germans, you know, controlled the Suez Canal, and or rather not the Suez Canal, but the Mediterranean itself. They couldn't safely go through the Mediterranean. So the British want to do that first. The Americans want to just hit them in the teeth, cross the English Channel in 1943, later that year, and knowing that it's going to be a bloodbath, knowing that they could very well lose the war, you know, by doing that, but just determined to go in there and punch them in the face and get the thing over. So 10 days of debate and discussion on those things, as well as a bunch of other issues, not getting really far with either of those things. There was serious worry that the conference might fail to come up with a common strategy. That could be a disaster. You know, if we're not on the same page, going the same direction, same resource allocation, we're going to have serious problems. So they go back and forth on this for days without progress. Eventually, this RAF officer, Sir John Slessor, also an unknown figure, was there as staff. So he's sitting in the kids' table behind the conference table with the British staff. The American staff are sitting behind the Americans. And because he doesn't have to participate, he's not in the debate, he's able to kind of watch and listen and absorb, watching people's faces, tone of voice, what they get angry about, what they don't get angry about, where they overlap, where the differences are. So he's got that all, in his head over these few days. And he goes up finally on the hotel roof where there's a roof garden at a lunch break and jots down on an old scruffy notebook, as he calls it, a compromise that might just do this trick and brings it back before lunch is over. So about an hour and a half, he sits there with this little notebook and writes out his little plan. Before we leave him, I want to point something out to you. Slessor had been a World War I pilot also, was a victim of polio in his early childhood. And you can see he's got his cane there on his right arm, under his right arm. This is his official portrait. He's making a statement with that cane. He's not ashamed of it. He's not afraid of it. He's leaning on it, which tells the world, this is what I've done with my disability, which I think is pretty impressive. He, by the way, flew those planes, was an ace in World War I, polio and all. So to come back to those maps again, I think it'll help us understand what I've tried to describe on the strategy. If you look at the Mediterranean there, you can see that, as General Brooks said, Greece and Sardinia, Sicily, the Dardanelles, all of that, kind of like fingers coming down into the Mediterranean is what he described them as. The Germans occupied all of it. So his thought is, here we are in, I don't have a pointer, but there's Casablanca over there, and the Anglo-American army is spread across Morocco and Algeria. They're still fighting the Germans in Tunisia, by the way. And you can see the black spot in North Africa, which the Germans are still in control of. But the idea on the British side, with primarily Brooke, is that because of all those places around the Mediterranean that the Germans have to defend, they won't know which one we're going to hit, okay? So they have to stretch themselves out, spread thin across that whole area, and then we pick the target, and we take that target, and then once we've consolidated the Mediterranean, then in 44 we'll go around and invade France with a stronger position, having weakened them and be in a much better position to win the war. The Americans, as I said. Oh, okay.
If you press here,
okay. Okay. Thank you. The British rather had been through Dunkirk. Don't forget, they knew what it was like to fight Germans in France. Brooke had been the mastermind of that. Everybody knows that the British troops were evacuated off the beach, at Dunkirk. People don't think about how they got there. They were about 150 miles inland in France when the Germans came across the border and just pushed everybody out of their way and had kind of encircled the British and were ready to take them. And Brooke had to come up with a way to fight 100 and some odd miles to the Channel through this enormous German army. And to pull that off in itself was just remarkable. If he hadn't done it, war would have been over in June of 1940. So we just owe so much to these people. It's really quite inspiring to see what they were able to accomplish. So we then come to, there were two plenary conferences, they called them, where all of the military and FDR and Churchill met together in Churchill's villa. So this is his Moroccan modern living room, dining room, I should say. They're sitting around the dining room table, and they would just hash everything out, what they had been through for the last 3 days at the military table, FDR's views, Churchill's views, and try to work through to a common ground that they could all sign on to. Those discussions in themselves are really fascinating because, no matter what the rank, no matter what the job or the station or the royal lineage, everybody's opinion was as good as the facts and the argument. It wasn't like, everybody deferring to Churchill and FDR or Marshall. It was a free-form conversation, very candid transcripts, 180 pages of transcripts, all of which is distilled for the book, but quite an interesting scene with all these great minds and great figures all trying to hash this stuff out around the same table. Toward the end of the conference, Roosevelt insisted on going out and seeing the troops, the American troops, who were getting ready to invade someplace in the Mediterranean or in France. Here is one of many photographs of him going down the line here with these troops assembled for inspection. General Mark Clark is sitting in the back seat there. He was in command of the Army, and the troops had thought it was an inspection by General Clark. They had no idea that FDR was going to be there. So they're all lined up here, and suddenly the Jeep comes down, and there's the president. There's sort of miraculous to them almost. Averell Harriman, who some of you may remember, close to FDR from childhood, was also at the conference. And he says at one point that at first the troops were shocked and their jaws fell open. They didn't know what to say. And then it was thrilling to hear their cheers. Here we have FDR and Harry Hopkins and Patton having lunch in the field with the Army. I think it was pork chops, potatoes, and peas. FDR said he was hoping for a hot dog. Patton writes about it and describes it as his lunch with the president al fresco. Another kind of side event here. FDR hosted a dinner for the Sultan of Morocco, who is sitting on his right hand there, a young man in his 30s. Churchill to his left. The Sultan's son is standing behind him, a 12-year-old boy who was smitten by Patton and said when he became Sultan, Patton would be his grand vizier, and they would go everywhere in a tank. So FDR, as probably everybody knows, was very anti-colonial, very geared toward, every small country in the world having its own destiny and its own control of its affairs. Churchill is the classic imperialist, right? At the head of the British Empire, doesn't want to hear a word about anti-colonialism. So at this dinner, FDR sitting next to the Sultan. You can see the look on Churchill's face. It's one of anxiety more than of pleasure. FDR proceeds to fill the Sultan's ear with all kinds of stuff about 5 years from now, you'll be independent, the French will be gone, we'll send MIT over here and tell you how to, run your infrastructure, and, you'll be a free country. And Churchill's like glowering and trying to change the subject and, getting up and sitting down again, and left with a cigar, they said, tightly clenched in his teeth. Another interesting story that I did not know about and came across in the research, there were 5 American women there, all members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps at the time. In those days, women were not, in the general army, they weren't in combat certainly, but they played an important role in other roles. These were 5 executive secretaries who worked for Eisenhower and his senior staff. They were based in Algeria. And it was arranged to have them come to Casablanca to serve in that role for the senior Americans. They had been the first American women in Europe during the war, 5 of them. And when they were sent to Algeria, it was thought to be safer to send them on a British troop ship that was headed there than to fly them. So they went on the British troop ship. And in the middle of December, in the night, the troop ship was torpedoed. Titanic type of story, inadequate lifeboats, the ship is sinking gradually, and 2 of the women were in the lifeboats. The other 3 didn't even get into the lifeboats because they were so disorganized, British ship. Eventually, a British destroyer comes along in the nick of time. They were thrown to the deck of the British destroyer and made it to Algeria, all five of them, through this harrowing ordeal. So FDR heard about this, somebody told him about it, and he invited them all to the White House in Casablanca for dinner. So the five of them come to dinner with Churchill, FDR, Mountbatten, Marshall, all these big, giants. And they all wrote something about it, letters home. One of them wrote an article for the local newspaper. This is Captain Louise Anderson, who wrote about it, held a press conference at home about it. And their story is really personal and I think gives a very interesting view of the scene from that level. Here's a photo that she had, which she had inscribed underneath, "Me and a friend." De Gaulle, everybody I guess is familiar with Le Grand Charles de Gaulle. Politics aside, de Gaulle makes Trump look like a modest man. De Gaulle had the biggest ego you could imagine, beyond description. At one point, and he starts dictating, this is what you guys are going to do, what you're not going to do. Churchill is saying, wait a minute, your country is under German control. You fought them for 2 weeks or something, okay? We're in charge of this thing now. And there's a battle between de Gaulle and Churchill throughout this conference, too, about Churchill trying to get de Gaulle to unite with another senior French general and combine their forces in one and have a united French opposition. De Gaulle won't hear of it because he wants his own power. At one point, Churchill gets asked by an American officer, so what's the latest with de Gaulle? And he says, well, don't speak of him. Let's not speak of him. We call him Joan of Arc, and we're looking for some bishops to burn him. Here we have his nemesis on the left, General Henri Giraud, who was the Vichy French senior general, whereas de Gaulle is the resistance figure. And the two of them, the Brits and the Americans are trying to get them to join forces. This is Giraud in prison camp, captured in 1940 with a German officer escorting him around the grounds in a German castle where he was imprisoned with other senior officers. He's 68, I think, at the time. And over the period of months, he came up with this plan, tied his bed sheets together, bargained with the guards for German clothing, chocolate for clothing and stuff. Middle of the night, he rappels down the side of the castle with the tied-in bed sheets in the rain, dressed as a German peasant or something, and somehow makes his way across Germany, occupied France, back to Vichy. So he's a national hero, just on that alone. And de Gaulle considers him an inferior and just won't deal with him. So that's a little subtext that we have going on. Ultimately, there's, at the end of the conference, there is a press conference called. The war correspondents from all over North Africa, American, British, French, and Canadian, are brought to Casablanca. They don't know where they're going or why or what's going to be there when they get there, but they're put on the lawn at FDR's villa, and the door opens up, and out comes de Gaulle, FDR, Churchill, and Giraud. And the point of having the two French there is they had been unable to get de Gaulle to agree to this deal. Giraud was fine with it. De Gaulle wouldn't move on it. So FDR pulls off a typical FDR trick, politician's trick. He spots out the window before they go out on the lawn an AP wire photographer that he's known for years. And he whispers in Harry Hopkins' ear, okay? Harry Hopkins goes out before the four of them come out, and he in turn whispers in this photographer's ear. So the four of them come out, they're sitting there. De Gaulle refuses to make any remarks or to in any way signify any agreement. The AP photographer shouts out, "Mr. President, can we have a shot of the two generals shaking hands?" And before de Gaulle can react, FDR puts his right hand under Giraud's elbow and his left hand under de Gaulle's elbow, and the two of them have to stand up. And shake hands as far apart from each other as the laws of physics allow. But that photograph was on the front page of every Allied newspaper the next day. French unity, big headline, all nonsense, completely fake news, if you will. Last two shots here, I guess, or three. These are those reporters assembled on the lawn with FDR and Churchill to the left there. As soon as the photo op was over, the two Frenchmen were whisked away, so they're not there. But FDR read a statement about what had happened there. And the biggest newsworthy event that had happened was there would be no negotiated peace. Unconditional surrender was the demand to the Germans and the Japanese. That was the eight-inch headlines across all the newspapers, unconditional surrender. Controversial then, controversial now. You know, wars don't end by unconditional surrender, almost always. There's always some kind of negotiation, some kind of resolution toward the end. But, and people, you know, against that policy were worried that it would make the enemy fight all the harder, you know, if they know there's an unconditional surrender coming up. My personal view is that Japanese weren't going to fight any harder, okay? And the Germans were going to have their country invaded anyway. So I think it was the right move. It added a lot of morale, a lot of determination. We've been on the ropes for 2.5 years. Now we're not only going to win, but it's going to be on unconditional surrender. So after the conference ends, Churchill invites FDR to come down to Marrakech, which he loved, Churchill did, and had painted there, you know, years earlier, and loved Marrakech. So he convinces FDR to spend an evening in Marrakech before they fly home. This is at the top of a minaret in Morocco, looking out at the view. After FDR went home, Churchill had his paints brought up to that tower, hadn't painted since the war started, and painted the scene from the tower, had the painting shipped to FDR as a gift. FDR left it, I don't know if he left it in his will or he gave it to Elliott Roosevelt, his son. Elliott, rest in peace, was not the most admirable human being who ever came down the pike. I think he had 5 marriages and a difficult guy. He sold the painting within days after he got it, and it somehow wound up in the hands of Brad Pitt, who gave it to Angelina while they were married. Angelina decided after they were divorced that she really didn't want it anymore, so she put it up for auction at Christie's. More than $6 million went for that portrait. I'm sure Churchill would have been thrilled, to say the least.
Where did it wind up?
I couldn't tell you. I think it was actually confidential. I don't think the name was released. Okay, so there we are. I'd be happy to take any questions or whatever else. Thank you. Sir.
Where was MacArthur?
MacArthur was in the Pacific. Yeah, he was in personal command in the Pacific.
Oh,
So
I know that, but he wasn't included
No.
at this level?
no, only the chiefs of staff. He was not a chief of staff. So
Okay.
yeah. Well, Patton was there because he was in command of the occupying army. Yeah. So,
Did the Soviets have any knowledge of this?
yeah, Stalin was invited. He knew it was going to happen. But as I say, they were busy with Stalingrad, which was just as well because he would have caused nothing but problems anyway. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering why was it so late, January 9th, 1943, when Pearl Harbor was 1941?
What took so long?
And then the other thing was, I asked, like, just as a woman, I just see these pictures of all men, and I'm glad you did out of those 5 women, but I just wonder what, if women had been involved, what would this have been like, you know?
Yeah, well, I guess we'll never know, but
But why was it, why'd they wait a whole year?
Yeah, well, like, as I said at the start, they were hanging on for their dear life for the first 2.5 years, just trying to survive, and on the ropes, both the Brits and us. And it was a matter of just kind of keeping the thing together until they could get to a position and go on the offensive, which was by this time. So what they gathered, because they needed a plan, they needed a strategic plan, which they didn't have, and that would be where it would be done. By the way, real quickly, I forgot one of the most important things. A couple of sentences. The compromise that I talked about, that didn't tell you what it was that the Americans could keep the same military forces in Asia that they had in the Pacific that were already there, okay? But they couldn't add any more. So other than replacing, losses. So that would be kind of frozen at that force level. So they wouldn't cut it back, which is what the Brits wanted to do, but they wouldn't increase it either. So that was that compromise. And then on the European side, the deal was that the Americans promised, or rather the British promised the Americans, that they would cross the Channel in the spring of '44, after they controlled the Mediterranean and had drained the British, and we'd both go in together in spring of '44, after the Americans added another couple of million troops and all kinds of shipping and controlled the Atlantic and all of that. So bottom line is, the Brits were right. That was the right way to do this. And, they had 2.5 centuries to figure it out. So the Americans were new to it. Yes, sir.
Do you want to say anything at all about the Yalta Conference early in 1945? You alluded to it once with respect to FDR's health.
Yeah.
But is there anything you want to add on Yalta?
Well, just generally, Yalta was, by the way, there were 3 conferences before this one, too. This is not the first time they met, okay? So they met 3 other times to try to sort things out, too. But Yalta was toward the very tail end of the war, and they knew who was going to win at that point. There wasn't any question about it. So that was really geared to what's going to happen after the war. What are the Soviets going to get? What are we going to get? How's all that going to be carved up? And that was when FDR was very ill and really dominated by Stalin and Churchill, unfortunately. Sir.
Did Churchill help carry Roosevelt up to the top of the tower?
He didn't help, but they had 2 Secret Service agents do it. FDR called them his horses, and one of them would hold them under one leg and the other under the other, arms around their necks, and they carried them up these, 100 steps or something. Yes.
Guadalcanal, the first big offensive of the U.S. in the Pacific, what was the timing of that with respect to this conference?
It was overlapping. It was going on during the conference, as I recall. I think that's right. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Was it just a coincidence that the movie Casablanca was so famous?
Yeah, it was just sheer coincidence. Yeah.
So weird.
Yeah.
As you were researching this, what was the biggest surprise to you? What did you learn that just knocked your socks off?
I think, to me, the biggest surprise was the level of tension between the British and the Americans. I kind of had this impression. I was a history minor, and I've read a lot of history, but not into that issue. And it turned out that there was a lot of cultural stress, a lot of jealousy and resentment, and difficult personal relationships going on. But those 10 days in this place, surrounded by barbed wire, were crucial. In the prior 3 conferences, one was in Washington, 2 were in London, and whoever the home team was would go back to their offices, and the other one would go to their hotels, and, business is done, see you in the morning. Here, they ate together, they went to the bar together, they sat around in each other's rooms like freshmen in college, and got to know each other and formed a real bond that carried them through the rest of the way. And here we are today. It's still there in large part this time.
There's a lot, obviously, about the stopping the Germans, beating back to unconditional surrender. Did they have knowledge at this conference thoroughly of any of the atrocities going on deep in Germany?
They did. They didn't know the depth of it, but in fact, at one point in the book, at the conference, a pitch was made to divert some American and British bombers to hit a rail junction in Poland. They didn't know about the death camps then, I don't think, but they knew that the Germans were brutalizing Poland, generally. And the Polish resistance really were begging almost for aircraft to help them, and they just didn't have the resources, so it didn't go.
The significance of your title, please.
Okay, I should have said that too. It goes back to Ira Aker, the Texas general who convinced Churchill to let the Americans keep bombing by day while the British bombed by night. And he made this big pitch to him, and he said, they'll be up all night. They'll never have a minute's peace. We'll be hitting them day in and day out, and we'll just keep them on their heels. And Churchill kind of leaned back and took out the cigar and said, "Yeah, I like it. The devils will get no rest." So that's where that came from. Yes, sir.
The personal relationship between FDR and Churchill, the kind of friendship, was it more a sort of a marriage convenience that got along well, or did you get the impression that they really were very, very close in their feelings for each other?
The latter. It was a really genuine friendship and bond. I can't think of anything that would bring two people together more than trying to win World War II together to start with. And FDR really respected and admired Churchill and vice versa. FDR's talents were political primarily, whereas FDR's were strategic, and they knew each other's sort of strengths and weaknesses. At one point, FDR actually sent a letter to Churchill in the middle of the war and closed almost on a whim. I can just kind of see it coming into his head. "It's fun to be in the same century with you."
Stalin was not at that conference. Did he fully support the concept of unconditional surrender? And did also Churchill fully support that?
Churchill, well, there's a story there too. There's always rabbit holes. But Churchill had talked about it with FDR casually during these 10 days. They hadn't, come to any firm agreement on it. And Churchill did not know that FDR was going to make that announcement at this press conference. And Churchill, FDR seems to have just blurted it out. It wasn't in his notes or anything. He just said in the middle of it that we're going to have a demand for unconditional surrender. And Churchill's head snaps over like that when he said this. And the reporters noticed that. But of course, what could he do? It's out of the bag now. So he went along with it.
What about Stalin?
Stalin, I'm not sure if I would have known 3 years ago when I was writing the book, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Where was Montgomery during all of this?
And Montgomery was fighting Rommel in Tunisia. Yeah. Trying to think of his name now, I'm blanking on his name. Senior general over Montgomery, for some reason, not getting it. But they were fighting in Tunisia at the time.
Any more questions?
Similar to the question that had been asked earlier about awareness of atrocities in Germany, were this group also aware of the atrocities that were going on in the Pacific and Manchukuo, in the Philippines and Indonesia,
The Japanese atrocities?
that had been collected through evidence by the American OSS?
Yeah.
Naval Intelligence.
Yeah, that's kind of beyond my knowledge base, I'm afraid. I'm not sure. I really don't know, frankly. I don't know. Yes, sir.
What was the age difference between Churchill and FDR?
I think Churchill was 7 years older, something like that.
Not too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so after Truman took over, were there any significant changes to the U.S.-British relationship, or had things pretty much been set at that point?
Well, when Truman took over, the war was effectively won, so it was downglide, from there. It wasn't as contentious and difficult as it had been. As far as I know, Truman got along fine with the British and vice versa. Okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Jim's going to be here, has his book. Please come up and he'll be signing them for you. Also, I just wanted to let you know the next fun event for the Wellesley Historical Society is we're having our holiday cocktail party at the new Wellesley History and Exhibit Center. So on December 10th, it's a Wednesday night, please go to our website and come have a little bit of fun and cheer. Thank you very much today for coming.